We're going to wait for, we got one more school coming, and we're just a little bit early, but seeing that there's an attentive audience, and shy as I am, I'm going to introduce myself and a little bit about the Jackson Center, a little bit of a bonus. I'm just killing time. Good news, I won't have to kill time. Ed, are we in a time schedule so that we're? Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay, so was that them? Is that Holy Family? Is there more coming? There's more coming? Okay, that's fine, that's fine. We talk about the Jackson Center. Jackson Center was formed in 2001 to advance the legacy of that guy, Robert Jackson. And as you'll learn a lot more about him through the presentation of Gail Jarrow. But during the period of time that we've been in existence, only 8 years, we've been privileged to have in this place where you are Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who's the Chief Justice of the United States, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, Linda Brown of Brown versus Board of Education. We've had Academy Award winner Bud Schulberg. We've had Phil Donahue here. We've had members of the court at the Nuremberg trial here. We've had law clerks who were with Justice Jackson here. We've had interesting people like James Meredith, who was the first black to integrate a major university, being the University of Mississippi. We had attorneys who were involved in the civil rights movement. So we've had many people who've come to tip their hat to Robert Jackson. How many people have read Gail's book? Okay, good job. And within that book, you will have seen pictures of some of these folks, and I don't want to steal any of Gail's thunder, but this place started 8 years ago. Before that, it was owned by an individual named Kent, Alonzo Kent, and he was an abolitionist who did not believe in slavery. This place here was, in fact, part of the Underground Railroad. And if you come back sometime on a field trip and go into the basement on the front corner, you'll actually see in the front basement floor the top of a door. Kind of neat. So this was owned by the Kent family through 1913. They sold it to the Scottish Rite Consistory, which was a grouping of Masonic orders, the Freemasons. And they owned it right up through 2001 when the Robert Jackson Center bought it. And it was in pretty rough shape. And during that period of time, we've had significant renovations. And I want to thank Penny Austin, whose husband was intimately involved in renovating this facility to what you see today so that we can enjoy that. Much has happened in a very short period of time, and we're just glad that these events we're able to share with all the students who are here today and all those who've been here. You're part of over 1,500 students who will have heard Gail Jarrow's presentation, and a number of schools throughout the Distance Learning Network, which will be hearing more today during this presentation. As you can see, we're being videotaped and broadcast through, I think, something like 60 school districts throughout the area. Big deal, and we in the Robert Jackson Center are just thrilled to be able to present such an opportunity. The Law, Youth, and Citizenship Program of the New York Bar Association was the group which really got us involved in the Authors Program. Preceding Gail, we've had Jerry Spinelli, we've had Lois Lowry, Christopher Paul Curtis, Karen Levine, and today Gail Jarrow, who will be introduced in just a few minutes. As you study, this is 7th and 8th grade, folks, right? Pardon? Some high school? Perfect, perfect. A couple of things that will be forthcoming that you may want to find of interest. Jackson, as you will learn, was the chief American prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. These pictures along the wall were donated to us by the official photographer. That was in 1945 and 1946. Part of the legacy of the Nuremberg trial are trials which are occurring in Rwanda, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, at The Hague, against folks who allegedly committed war crimes. The chief prosecutors of all of those tribunals, current tribunals, are all coming here. August 31st and September 1st, they've never been together. And it's very exciting for us, so that when you hear today Gail talk about somebody in 1945, 1946, that it's so relevant that coming later, literally at the end of August, are the top chief prosecutors of those tribunals, together with members of the Nuremberg Trial Court, etc. I want to thank everybody for coming here today. And I just want to make sure, is there anybody here from Jamestown High School? Okay, good. Maple Grove. Okay. Erie Day School. Welcome from Erie. Holy Family. Perfect. Earlier, we had a chance to recognize the students who won the essay contest, New York State-sponsored essay contest on Robert Jackson. Si Ching Shu from Queens, Adasha Lewis from Brooklyn, Allison Katie from Sherman Central School, Genevieve Wappett from Chautauqua Lake Central School, Kimberly Lindquist from Purcell School, and somebody may know this person, Lars Benson from the Jamestown Area Homeschool. Anybody know Lars Benson? Is he a good guy? Oh yeah, that was, for the video, that was a yes. They all were commended for their work on the essay contest, and they received a certificate, an autographed book, as well as a savings bond. And I just want to give them all of applause, because an awful lot of folks are watching this now on TV. So let's congratulate all 6 of those folks. This does not happen without corporate sponsors. And as I mentioned, the New York State Bar Association Law, Youth and Citizenship Program, National Fuel, Hodgson Russ, SKF, Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, through the Carl Peterson Fund, the Lyle Peterson Fund, the William and Nancy Jackson Fund, Jamestown Savings Bank, the Legend Group, Bly, Sheffield, Barger, Pilitary, and McCullum, Brajota's Farmland Produce and Garden Center, Campbell and Shelton, Carlson's Jewelry Smithing, Courier Capital Corporation, Evans Elfie's Restaurant, Jamestown Community College, Moore and Myatt, Robo Enterprises, and Yaw Oil. And to them we say a hearty thank you for making this all possible. We're privileged to have Gail Jarrow make a presentation, and in order to introduce her, I want to bring to the podium Anita Sanctuary, whose tireless efforts have really orchestrated all of you being here today, and we and the Jackson Center can't thank her enough for all that she's done for us. Anita?
Thank you, Greg. Before I introduce Gail, I want to acknowledge those students who participated but were not in the finalists in the New York State Writing Contest. I'd like to thank the teachers who solicited questions for Gail Jarrow to consider for her presentation as well. We've come together today because of a remarkable biography written by the celebrated author Gail Jarrow. Her biography of the life of Robert H. Jackson teaches all of us about this inspirational man who devoted his life to truth, honesty, high ideals, and public service. Jackson's commitment to social justice has had a far-reaching and lasting effect on national and international law. A star is assigned to books of outstanding merit as determined by the editors of Kirkus Reviews. Ms. Jarrow's biography of Jackson received this star award along with the Editor's Choice Award for Best Young Adult Books of 2008. We are anxious to hear Gail Jarrow's message, why write about history? Why read it? Please welcome this talented multi-award winning author, Gail Jarrow.
Thank you, Anita. It's really nice for me to be here because most of the time I'm sitting in front of my computer just imagining you, my audience of teens that are reading my books. So getting an opportunity to actually come and look you in the face is a lot more fun than looking at a computer screen. So I'm glad to be here. And I'm also very pleased to be in Jamestown. I've been here several times since I became involved in Robert Jackson's biography. I love coming here. I've met a lot of people. It's great to see them when I come back. So it's a pleasant experience for me all the way around. I know you've read the book, and some of you have submitted questions that I received ahead of time, and I will try to answer those through the talk I'm going to give. If I don't get to something, maybe we'll have a little time at the end and you can ask me something that's on your mind. The other thing I'm going to be doing in this talk is to show you some photographs that are not in the book. These are from the same places that I got the photographs that are in the book, but they're new, and I thought they'd be fun for you to see. Some of them are from the Jackson Center's collection. Some are from the Fenton Museum here in Jamestown. Some are from the presidential libraries, Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, who were the two presidents under whom Jackson worked. And the big place where I found some very neat photographs was the Library of Congress. I was just there last weekend doing research on my next book, which is on Civil War spy balloons. And for that book, I'm going to have a lot of Civil War era photographs. But while I was there, I decided to go back into the files, and I'm going to talk about the Library of Congress files in a minute. But I wanted to go back in the files and look at the photographs of Jackson and take photographs of those photographs so that I could incorporate it into this talk. And I think you'll like some of the ones that I found. Finally, I'm going to show you 3 clips, film clips, of Jackson actually giving a speech. Now, he was known as a great orator. He was admired for his speeches, particularly the opening and closing addresses that he made at Nuremberg. I still see people reference those in the print, in the press. But I thought it would be great for you to actually, if you haven't already seen these, actually to see Jackson give a speech. So I'm going to show you 3 pieces of speeches that he gave, and Greg Peterson and the Jackson Center helped me to obtain these and get them put into my PowerPoint so you could see them. Now, one of the questions that a lot of people have asked me is, why did you write a biography of Robert Jackson? It's a good question because nobody had written a biography of Jackson in more than 50 years. And that was one that was done by a lawyer, and it was written for adults. So it's more difficult to read, and certainly not a book that most middle school and high school kids would be reading. My publisher was very interested in Jackson because he is from this area, and he knew about Robert Jackson, and he knew about the Jackson Center. So he asked me if I might be interested in writing the book. Now, the reason he asked me has something to do with my biography. I have been a writer professionally, meaning I get paid for it, for more than 25 years. But I've been a writer for many more years than that, since I was about 7 years old, just because I love doing it. And I bet there are several of you that are the same way. You just like to write. It's the way you express yourself, and it's something you love. And if you can manage to take something you love and turn it into a career, that's perfect. And that's what I've been able to do. Now, I've written all kinds of things. I almost always write for your age group, though, partly because I used to teach middle school. And I taught science and math. I did not teach history, which some people are surprised to find out. But I do like your age group, and I tend to write toward that age group. I've written fiction, I've written science, and I've started writing history because I think it is so important to know what has happened in the past. What has happened before really does affect what happens now and in the future. And if you understand what happened in the past and you're aware of it, you can make your own life better. You can learn from mistakes that people made before. I found by watching current events that the best leaders our country has had are those that do know the past. They do know history. They do know that when certain situations get started, they could end up here. And if you don't want them to end up here, there's certain things you can do to avoid that. It's this knowledge of history that makes me want to write more about it and help you know more about it. Robert Jackson was a student of history himself. He loved to study it, he knew a lot about it, and he knew its importance. And that is clear in the things that he's written, particularly clear in the fact that he wanted to take on the Nuremberg trials. He knew how important it was to try the Nazis correctly and to set precedent. Now, the last book that I wrote was called The Printer's Trial. This is about the trial in 1735 of John Peter Zenger, who was a printer. How many of you have ever heard of him? Do you know who he is? Nobody? Yeah? Okay, good for those few hands that are up. This trial really had a lot to do with today, and you might not realize how. But in 1735, if you remember your history, we were not independent of Britain. We were a colony. We were 13 colonies underneath Britain's thumb. John Peter Zenger had a newspaper in New York City. There were politicians in New York City that did not like the British governor, and they were critical of him in print in John Peter Zenger's newspaper. Well, the British governor was not happy about this. He wanted to shut the newspaper down so there would be no criticisms of him, and the way he did it was to put John Peter Zenger in jail. There was a trial, and at the end of the trial, a colonial jury found Zenger innocent, and because of that, the British government decided they were not going to prosecute newspaper editors anymore in the colonies for printing criticisms of the British government. The result of that is that the press in the colonies became very free, and over a generation of their criticisms of the British government, they were able, the result was, and they were able to rile up the people against the British, and we ended up having a revolution. Now, you know today that freedom of the press is a very important part of our democracy. It's in our Constitution, and it really goes back to the fact that this trial enabled the press in the colonies to be free. This is the kind of way that I like to look at history, to find things that happened before, and to show how it impacts what happens today. Because I wrote this book for my publisher, and it was a legal history, he thought I might be the author who would be interested in writing about Jackson. Now, I knew who Jackson was, but I knew very little about him. So I came here to Jamestown for the first time. I came to the Jackson Center, where you are. I talked to people that were here. I read materials that they had about Jackson, and I was looking for some clue as to whether Jackson's life was compelling enough for me to write a book for your age group. And was it compelling enough for me to stay involved in it for 2 years? Because that's how long it took me, from the beginning of when I first got into this project till the day the book came out in print. So I had to really care about it in order to stay so involved. Well, after I visited Jamestown and did some of this reading, I determined that yes, I was interested enough, and he certainly did have a compelling enough life, and he was relevant today. And these were all things that convinced me that it was worth writing this biography. Well, I had to get started on it, and I had to overcome a few things. First of all, Jackson lived in a different time from me. I didn't know him. I didn't know where he was from, this area. I didn't really know much about it. And for me to write a book, I really need to be able to identify in some way with the subject. So I looked for ways to do that. And I found out that Jackson was from a town, Frewsburg, that was not so different from a very important town in my life, Royersford, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. This is right outside of Philadelphia, about 30 miles outside. Now, if you look at these two photographs, which are from the same period of history, you see that Frewsburg and Royersford had a lot in common. They both have the dirt streets, they have the horse-drawn carriages, they have the stores along Main Street and the trees growing there. Now, I was not alive in 1912, but my grandparents were. My grandparents were about the same age as Robert Jackson, and since I grew up in this town with my grandparents around, with my great aunts and uncles around, I heard a lot about my town through the period of time that Jackson lived. And I also heard just generally what the country was like, what the period of history was like. My grandmother especially, who lived to 91, told me a lot of stories about World War I, the Depression, World War II, and all of this helped me when I started reading about Jackson, because I had something I could grab hold of and I could understand and relate to. And in understanding it myself, I hope to help you relate to it as well. Now, there's another problem with writing about Jackson, and that is that he lived quite a long time ago. Here's his boyhood home in Frewsburg, which is still there. He lived for 62 years, but I was only going to write a 100-page book. That meant that I could not cover everything about his life. I couldn't even find out everything about his life. I had to limit myself. So I wanted to hit the high points. What were the turning points in his life? What were the things that made Jackson who he was? What helped him accomplish what he accomplished in his life? That was really the goal of my research. I wanted to find the story in his life. So I had to start someplace, and I started where I live, which is Ithaca, New York. And I'm lucky enough that Cornell University is there. Olin Library is the main library at Cornell. There's several libraries, and there is a law school at Cornell, so there's a good law library. Cornell has more than 7 million books, which is amazing if you think about how many books that is. Because they have so many books, I could find just about everything I needed to do the research on Jackson in terms of books. Now, I'm going to tell you in a little while where else I found information. But I had to find books about Jackson because he, of course, was dead. I couldn't interview him. Most of the people that knew him were dead. There were some people alive, but they were children during his lifetime, and that wasn't really too much help to me because children don't remember the kind of things I needed to know. And furthermore, I wanted to know about his own youth growing up here, and nobody was alive that was there then. So I had to find other sources. But there, fortunately, were people that wrote their memoirs about important periods of history, including the Roosevelt administration, Nuremberg, World War II. All of these people that knew Jackson and knew him on the Supreme Court bench provided me some information because I read their memoirs and found out what they thought of Jackson. I also read what legal scholars said about Jackson. That helped me to find out how he fits into the whole legal scheme from his time on the Supreme Court bench. And Jackson himself wrote books, and I was able to read those and find out more about his career. But he doesn't talk about himself in those books, so I had to go somewhere else to get that information. And where I went was another university in New York State, and Columbia in New York City. Now, this is a photograph of Butler Library, and in Butler Library is an oral history of Robert Jackson. Now, let me explain what that means, what that is. During the last 2 years of Jackson's life, although nobody knew those were the last 2 years, somebody from Columbia went to Washington, where Jackson was in the Supreme Court, and tape recorded him talking about his life. There were a series of sessions that they held, and there were interview questions that Jackson was working from. But he basically talked about his life from his earliest beginnings, his childhood in Frewsburg, even his birth in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania, his days in Jamestown as an attorney, all the way to Nuremberg. He does not talk in the oral history about the Supreme Court period because he was on the court and he didn't think it was appropriate to be talking about the court while he was a member of it. But this is about 1,600 typed pages, because what they did is after it was tape recorded, they typed it all up so that people could access it. That is all kept at Columbia, and it's a lot of reading, but I did it because I wanted to find out more about the inside man, find out what made Jackson the man he was and what he thought made him the man he was. So that the oral history was one of my sources that I use quite a bit and reference in the book. The other place where I found a lot of information, but sort of atmospheric information, was the Supreme Court. I did not go there to collect facts or look up anything, because most of this, well, all the Supreme Court opinions are online. You can go read the decisions of the court. But I went there for the feeling of being in the Supreme Court and in the courtroom where Jackson spent time, arguing cases as a Solicitor General and then on the bench listening to cases as a Supreme Court Justice. But being in the room where he spent time helped me to identify with that and write about it better in my own book. Just a few blocks away is the Library of Congress. And there are several buildings to that. The one I was interested in is this one. This is the Madison Building, named after James Madison. Inside this building is the manuscript division of the Library of Congress, and there are one-of-a-kind manuscripts of many famous people that have been donated to the library. Jackson's papers were donated by his family after his death, and they include an incredible range of materials, including professional things like his Supreme Court papers, but there are private things. There are, you're going to see some examples, there are things from his childhood, there are cards, birthday cards that people sent him, there are personal letters that he wrote and that people wrote to him. There are things from the Nuremberg trial that are quite interesting. I'm going to show you an example. One of the things I found there was Adolf Hitler's will that was found by somebody in the army after Hitler committed suicide, and Jackson was given a copy of it while he was in Nuremberg. Jackson's own will is there. There are letters of condolences to his wife and family after his death. It's really the range of Jackson's life, and a lot to read and a lot to look at, but what a great resource for me. And all of this I used to try to find out what made Jackson so successful in life. He definitely had some strengths. And you know from reading the book that one of them was that he was a great writer. He was admired during his own time for his ability to write, but even today, people that know a lot about the Supreme Court say that Jackson was one of the best writers to ever sit on the court, and that is saying something. Now, why I put this up, this is from the Library of Congress. This is his autobiography. Now, he never published an autobiography, but in 1944 he started to write one. Some of it is typed, but this is the beginning of it, and it's handwritten, and that's why I thought it'd be fun to show you. And I'm showing it to you so you can see how he edited his work. Notice how he crosses out words or sentences while he was writing this. He really became a great writer because he did edit his work. He was not one of these people that the first thing he put down was it. I'm going to read you this because I know his handwriting is kind of difficult to read. And I want you to listen when I read it to the way he uses language to describe his birthplace. And there's also a hint of his sense of humor. Everything I read about him, from people who knew him personally, mentioned his wit and his sense of humor. So this is about the day he was born. The 13th of February, 1892, is a day I recall but vaguely, despite its significance. The sun rose late and threw a cold light over the snow, which blanketed the fields and blocked the roads of the Allegheny foothills, which framed the old Jackson farm. Mother did not get up that morning, a very unusual thing for her. She was having pains. Now, one of the photographs that I really like is this one. Now, this is a photograph of Jackson's birthplace. Those are his parents standing in front of the farmhouse where Jackson was born. And on the left, standing by a horse, is his Uncle William. Now, his uncle lived with the family until his death. So Jackson was about 7 years old when Uncle William died. Jackson talks about in his oral history how important Uncle William was to his life. He spent a lot of time with him in the first 7 years of his life. And because Uncle William was the Justice of the Peace in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania, Jackson says he got his first taste of law from Uncle William. And that might be where the seed of wanting to be a lawyer was sown. Now, I wasn't sure when I saw this photograph for the first time that that was Uncle William. This photograph came from Jackson's niece, Darlene Hetrick. Her grandmother was Jackson's sister, and she lives in Frewsburg today. And when I went to Frewsburg last May to talk to the students there, I met her, and she showed me the photographs that she had, some family photographs, and this was one of them. This was not in the first printing of the book, but we have reprinted the book. It just came out again, and this photograph is in it, because it's so great. I really like it. Another thing about this, besides Uncle William in the photograph, and I wanted to say to you, the reason I know it's Uncle William is because last weekend when I went to the Library of Congress, I did find a photograph of Uncle William with Robert and Ella, his little sister. And it's definitely this man in the picture. You notice all the horses. Horses were important to Jackson for his entire life. And he took them to Washington when he had enough land to keep horses. He talks about his horses in his letter from Nuremberg, about how much he misses his horse. Here it is. His father bred horses, and Jackson really gained an appreciation, a love of horses from his childhood. Here's a photograph that I took from the Library of Congress this weekend. This is baby Robert. Wasn't he cute? No? And here he is with his sister Ella. She was 2 years younger. I think he was probably about 3 in this photograph. And you can see how people dressed their children for photographs in those days. Now, another one of Jackson's traits and strengths, other than his writing ability, was his intellect. Now, this is a photograph of Jackson in 4th grade standing in front of the Frewsburg School. But he didn't always show signs of the great intellect. This is his report card from 2nd grade. Take a look at his grades. They're not that great. This is percentage. Notice particularly his spelling grade, 78%, because I'm going to show you a slide later that comes back to that. Language or grammar, 76%, which is interesting because this is a man known for his ability to speak and write well. But when he was in 2nd grade, he wasn't a superstar. But 2 years later, 4th grade, things looked up, and he was much more of an A student. He had gone up to a 96 in grammar and language. So to me, this just shows that people can improve, and he did. One thing Jackson mentions in his oral history is how much he started to read as a child. He read a lot. And I think that probably between 2nd and 4th grade, one of the things that helped him become a better student was that he read more. He read his entire life. He says that he used to make notations in the margins of books. He read widely. He really educated himself by reading. He remained a good student all the way through high school at Frewsburg. Here he is. This, I think, is a 9th grade report card. Also, all of these are from the Library of Congress, these report cards. He has a 98% average. He had English 1 and algebra, so that's why I think it's 9th grade. Now, you know, it's amazing when you go to the Library of Congress and you see these report cards and you stop and say to yourself, why in the world did anybody save these? I don't think my parents would have done that. But not only did his parents save them, but his family saved them after his death. So they're there for us to look at now. And it tells you something about him. Jackson loved learning so much that when he finished at Frewsburg High School, he went to another year of high school here in Jamestown. Now, Frewsburg was a small school. He praised the school, but because it was small, he did not get exposed to the course material that he really wanted. And Jamestown, being a bigger school, could expose him to subjects he hadn't had. So he did really love learning enough to go to an extra year of high school. He didn't go to college, and it became more important that he went to this extra year of high school, as it turned out. Another strength of Jackson's, of course, is his ability to speak, his oration skills. And when he was in Jamestown High School, he was on the debate team. These are from the book. You've seen these photographs before. Jackson in his oration debate mode, and then with the other members of the debate team when they won an award for their debate abilities. But Jackson knew from the time he was your age, 13 or 14, he knew that he was good at speaking. He sought out opportunities to speak publicly. He joined debate teams, and I was surprised when I looked into his papers and found out that when he was 14, adult groups were asking him to come and speak. A 14-year-old speaking to a group of adults is pretty amazing, and in those days even more amazing because they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio, they didn't have movies. The way they entertained themselves with public gatherings was by somebody standing up and giving a speech. And they wanted Robert Jackson to come do that. So even at that young age, he had that talent, and he developed it as he grew through school. Now, all of these talents kind of naturally led him to the decision when he was 18 that he wanted to be a lawyer. But he had some obstacles to overcome. His family wasn't wealthy, so there was going to be the issue of how could he afford law school. But not only that, his father didn't want him to be a lawyer. His father didn't like lawyers, and he wasn't really willing to help Jackson. Jackson finally was able to find an apprenticeship in Jamestown with a distant relative named Frank Mott, who was a lawyer here, but his father didn't like Frank Mott either. So Jackson basically had to defy his father to take this apprenticeship. And then after 1 year of an apprenticeship, he wanted to go to law school. He borrowed the money from his mother's brother. He was able to go to law school and come back and do a 3rd year as an apprentice, and then take the bar and become a lawyer. So Jackson had really decided on his goal when he was 18, and he worked hard to find ways to get to it, to the end of it, and to succeed. And he managed to. And he practiced law in Jamestown for 20 years before he went to Washington. So that helped me know more about Jackson getting to that point, getting to see how he became a lawyer. But I wanted to know more about the personal side. How did he spend his adult life? What was his family like? And I used the personal letters that were in the Library of Congress to help me get insight into what his family was like. Letters that he wrote to his wife, that he wrote to his children, that his children wrote to him, the other family members, his mother, his sisters. These letters are all there in the Library of Congress. And when people write personal letters, they don't think anyone's ever going to see those letters except the recipient. So they're usually very honest, and they really show what a person's like. And particularly if they're writing to someone that's close to them in their family, you really see the real person. That's why those letters were so important, and I really value getting to read them. Now, this is a photograph of Jackson with his wife Irene in 1932, with the lake in the background. You can see it at the far background. He loved this area. He spoke about it in his autobiography and in the oral history, how much he loved it and how much he was influenced by it. You can also see the horses. He loved them. And they loved him, apparently. This photograph was in the Library of Congress. I took it this weekend. There were several like this, and they didn't all, the others didn't come out very well when I photographed them, but you know, I just love the photograph, and I thought this says so much about Jackson, because only somebody that really, really loves horses would let one do that to him. Here's Jackson with his children. 1930, so his son Bill was about 11, his daughter Mary was about 9. People have asked me what happened to his family. His wife, Irene, lived until 1986. She died at the age of 96. His children both died in the same year in 1999. And Jackson had 8 grandchildren. They weren't all born before he died, but there were ultimately 8 grandchildren, and they're all still alive. He spent a lot of time with his children, and you can tell from the letters that they wrote him and that he wrote them. They had a very warm relationship. Now, all these photographs, as you see, are black and white. And I wanted to know more about what Jackson looked like. I wanted to be able to visualize him as I was writing about him. And fortunately, the Library of Congress has his driver's licenses for about 20 years, if you can believe that. This particular document is a fishing license that Jackson got when he was 56, and on it, as on the driver's licenses, it has the color of his hair is brown, blue eyes. At that time, he weighed 170, and he was 5'8.5" according to this. His driver's licenses put him at 5'9". So in the book, I gave him a ½ inch and made him 5'9", and I hope he appreciates that. Now, Jackson probably would have stayed in Jamestown practicing law if it hadn't been for Franklin Roosevelt. He knew Roosevelt since Jackson was 19, and he was friends with Roosevelt and helped him politically. Roosevelt became governor of New York and then ultimately president. He took the oath in 1933, and he invited Jackson to come to Washington to work on the New Deal. Jackson left Jamestown, and the rest is history, as they say. It really was a turning point in his life when he left here and went to Washington, because he was able to have an incredible impact. And it was because of his relationship with Roosevelt. I want just to stop a minute and have you notice this photograph of Roosevelt. Do you all know that Roosevelt had had polio and was paralyzed? Does everybody know that? Almost every photograph, I think there's only one that has been published, shows Roosevelt in a wheelchair, but he couldn't stand by himself without help. He wore leg braces, and you can see in this photograph that he is holding on to a pole to keep himself erect. If you ever see any photographs of Roosevelt, you're going to notice that he's holding on to people when he's standing. The press was really respectful of that. They never took these photographs to show him in a wheelchair. So amazingly, I've read that people that lived at the time, a lot of them did not know that Roosevelt had had polio and was paralyzed. So I'm not sure that could ever happen today, but in those days it did. Roosevelt promoted Jackson fairly often, and he made quite a rise through positions of power. In 1939, he was a Solicitor General, and this shows him with his wife in his office. On the walls, you see photographs of his daughter Mary and his son Bill. And on his desk, you see, this is a photograph I just found. On his desk, there is a little statue of Don Quixote. Does anybody know who that is? Yes. Yeah, good guess. Do you know who he was? I don't want to put you on the spot. Well, he's actually a fictional character, but you're pretty close.
He was in a book, and he had a donkey, and he was like insane.
That's very good, very good. This is a bit of a homework assignment. Go find out who Don Quixote was and try to figure out why Robert Jackson would put a statue of him on his desk. And think about that. In 1940, Roosevelt appointed Jackson to be Attorney General. And as he said in his autobiography, I stepped into a sea of troubles. And that's because in 1940, things were not good in the world. Hitler had basically overrun Europe. Roosevelt knew at that time there was no way the United States was not going to get involved in the war. I mean, we were already a little bit involved by helping Britain, but people were worried here. Roosevelt started building up the country's defenses and military. There were defense plants that were starting to build munitions, and people were worried about spies, especially from Germany and Italy, coming here and causing trouble, going into these defense factories and sabotaging them. As Attorney General in charge of law enforcement for the country, Jackson was responsible for keeping things safe for the country at the same time that people's rights were not trampled. So that was a difficult balance for him, and that's why it was a sea of troubles for him. Now, I'm going to show you a very short video of him talking about this problem and how people are worried about whether the Justice Department is adequately protecting against these spies and sabotage. And it gives you a chance to see Jackson in action. This is from November 1940. So it's a whole year before Pearl Harbor and the U.S. getting into the war.
The effectiveness of our secret agents depends on their being unknown and unannounced. Many of them operate in peril of their lives and must work quietly and without publicity. But I can assure the American public that the combined forces of the Army Intelligence, the Navy Intelligence, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, by methods quite consistent with American traditions, are well able to deal with organized sabotage, espionage, and the fifth column activities.
Now keep in mind, this was almost 70 years ago. But in many ways, times haven't changed, or we've come back to it. And this is what I mean about how knowing history helps you understand things going on today. Because today we're worried about terrorists, and the Attorney General has a similar problem of balancing the safety of the country. And remember, the Attorney General's in charge of the FBI, for example. Balancing the safety of the country, balancing that with individual rights of the citizens and people that are living here. About a month ago, I saw a news article that really brought this home to me. It was about our new Attorney General, Eric Holder. There's a tradition that when an Attorney General takes office, he can choose 4 portraits of previous Attorney Generals to hang in a place of honor in the Justice Department. And Eric Holder chose Robert Jackson as one of those 4. Jackson, having been Attorney General 70 years before almost, That was really amazing. And Holder went on to make comments to the press about how Jackson was a role model for him, and how he really admired Jackson. So this is a man who is still very relevant. I did a little more research and I found out that the previous two attorney generals also put Jackson's portrait in a place of honor, and they were Republicans. So that tells you that Jackson's appeal, people that admire him are from all places on the political spectrum. He's very much respected. He was attorney general for about a year and a half, and then Roosevelt appointed him to the Supreme Court. Now, these are just three of the cases in which he was involved. I talk about them in the book. I just wanted to put up some photographs of them just to highlight again that Jackson's writings on the Supreme Court are still discussed today. The picture with the girls, those are the Barnett sisters. This was the flag salute case, and Jackson wrote the decision for the majority on that. On the picture on the right are a Japanese-American family and their belongings being loaded into a truck to take them to an internment camp. And this became the basis of the Korematsu case, Fred Korematsu being one of the Japanese-Americans who did not agree that he should have to go to an internment camp, and his case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The court ruled that, in fact, these internment camps were legal and it was okay to put these people in them during the war, but Jackson was in the minority on that decision. And today, most people would say that that was a mistake by the court. But Jackson, though he was the minority, had believed the principle of interning these people was wrong, and he stood up for that. The picture in the bottom represents Brown versus Board of Ed. That was the unanimous decision by the Supreme Court to disallow separated schools by race. The people are lined up at the Supreme Court in this photograph to listen to the arguments that were presented in December of 1953. The court gave its decision in 1954. You can go and listen to the Supreme Court anytime you want to when they're in session, but you have to stand in line to do it, and that's what these people were doing. So if you ever get a chance and you have the time, I'd recommend it. Now, in April 1945, Jackson is on the Supreme Court still, but Harry Truman, who just became president when Franklin Roosevelt died suddenly, Truman came to Jackson and asked him if he would be willing to be the chief American prosecutor at the trial that was being organized to try the Nazi leaders. Now, in April, when this happened, the war was still going on, but it was clear that the Nazis were going to be defeated. They didn't have these people in prison yet. They hadn't captured them. They didn't even know that Hitler was not going to be a prisoner because he hadn't committed suicide yet. But they were planning, and they were getting ready. Truman wanted Jackson to do it, and Jackson took it because, as I mentioned, he had a sense of history. He knew how very important this trial was. It was going to set a precedent of how you deal with losers in a war. How do you handle the issue of aggressive war? And he wanted a trial, a fair trial, not one that was rigged, which has happened before in history and continues to happen in some places. He wanted this to be fair, in which the prosecution had to present a case. They had to use evidence to prove their case. He wanted the defendants to be able to have their own lawyers to defend themselves. He wanted the judges to be independent, not to have made up their minds before they came to this trial. The judges were to listen to the evidence and then make their decision. And Jackson also recognized that if they did this right, there could be some of the defendants found innocent. And in fact, 3 of them were acquitted. The Allies had to make up a whole new set of legal procedures in order to do this, to run this trial. And they had incredible amount of evidence to go through. Jackson said before the trial began, during that summer while they were pulling it together, I did not think men would ever be so foolish as to put in writing some of the things the Germans did put in writing. This photograph gives you a feel for how much evidence there was, documentary evidence. According to, these are Jackson's numbers, that there were 100,000 documents that they had to go through and decide what they were going to use in the trial, 25,000 photographs, and millions of feet of film, all of which were created by the Nazis themselves. Now, I'm going to show you a video of Jackson giving his opening statement at Nuremberg. This is on the second day of the trial. And pay attention and keep your ears open for a few things. First of all, he talks about how there'd never been a trial like this before. He talks about how 8 months before the trial began, the war was still going on and all these defendants were still running loose. He talks about hundreds of tons of documents that they're using, that they captured and they could use for evidence. And importantly, he does talk about how historians will have to go deeper into the evidence and into these documents to show what happened. This is so important. Yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day. Jackson himself said at the time, there are going to be people in the future that are going to say this never happened. They're going to deny that the Holocaust ever occurred. And by doing this trial, having all this evidence collected and made into a historical record, you can point to that and say that those people don't know what they're talking about. That's wrong. There was a Holocaust and here's the proof. Jackson felt that and believed that, and that was one of the things that drove him as he was chief prosecutor for the Americans at the trial. So just listen for those points. And this is from Court TV. This was originally filmed by the Army, and it's preserved today because of that. It gives you a chance to see Jackson in action.
The Chief Prosecutor for the United States of America.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This tribunal, while it is novel and experimental, is not the product of abstract speculation, nor is it created to vindicate legalistic theories. This inquest represents the practical effort of four of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 15 more, to utilize international law to meet the greatest menace of our times, aggressive war. Never before in legal history has an effort been made to bring within the scope of a single litigation the developments of a decade, covering a whole continent, involving a score of nations, countless individuals, and innumerable events. Despite the magnitude of the task, the world has demanded immediate action. This demand has had to be met. though perhaps at the cost of finished craftsmanship. Established courts, following familiar procedures, applying well-thumbed precedents, dealing with the consequences of local and limited events, seldom commence a trial within a year of the event in litigation. Yet less than 8 months ago today, the courtroom in which you sit was an enemy fortress in the hands of the SS troops. Less than 8 months ago, nearly all of our witnesses and documents were in enemy hands. The law had not been codified. No procedures had been established. No tribunal was in existence. No usable courthouse stood here. None of the hundreds of tons of official German documents had been examined. No prosecuting staff had been assembled. Nearly all of the present defendants were at large, and the 4 prosecuting powers had not yet joined in common cause to try them. I should be the last to deny that this court, this case, may very well suffer from incomplete researches, and quite likely will not be the example of professional work which any of the prosecuting nations would normally wish to sponsor. It is, however, a completely adequate case to the judgment we shall ask you to render, and its fuller development we shall be obliged to leave to historians, because we have not had the time to examine all of the sources of evidence that might be available.
Now, after he gave this speech, he received a lot of accolades from all over the world. It was recognized as a great speech, went on for 4 hours. You've just seen 4 minutes. And I was interested in, how did Jackson feel about it? How did he feel about it on a personal level? And I found the answer to that because the day after he gave this speech, he wrote to his wife. She was back in Washington. He wrote to her about it. And I made a copy of a piece of that letter so that you could see it. He wrote in it, "The speech was very well received, and God were we relieved. I had done it over a dozen times, and for weeks, Elsie," that was his secretary, "worked on it every night, for we got little done at the office. Bill," that was his son who was there as his assistant, "Bill was up until 5 a.m. getting it finally in the mimeograph." A mimeograph is a copy machine. Now, I read that and I thought, this shows how much he practiced this speech. He didn't just get up and give it. He really prepared, and he was relieved, so you know that he was worried about it and wanted it to be good. Now, remember how I told you he had that not-so-great grade in spelling? If you look at the second line of this, if you're able to read his handwriting, he writes the word relieved, and he misspells it. I found several letters that Jackson wrote in which he had misspellings. But these are letters. He didn't probably have a dictionary with him. But know that when he wrote a formal piece, he fixed his spelling. Now, the trial continued for many months. Finally, in July 1946, it was time for Jackson to give his closing address to the tribunal. Now, in the Library of Congress, there is the actual reading copy that he had in Nuremberg on the podium with him as he gave this address. It's 70 pages long. He had his secretary triple space it so that when he was reading it, he could read it more easily. And what you might not be able to see right now, but I think you'll see in a minute, in the next slide, he put slash marks where he wanted to pause as he was speaking, and underlines where he wanted to emphasize a word. He really cared about this speech, too, and getting it right. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of his final speech to the military tribunal. It's the beginning and the end of the speech, spliced together. Near the beginning, you're going to be able to see part of this. It's at the top of the screen. I'm going to just raise my hand when he gets to that part in the speech. And try to follow along and see how he did pause and emphasize according to his notes.
Mr. President and members of the tribunal, an advocate can be confronted with few more formidable tasks than to select his closing arguments where there is a great disparity between his appropriate time and his available material. In 8 months, a short time as state trials go, we have introduced evidence which embraces as vast and varied a panorama of events as has ever been compressed within the framework of a litigation. It is impossible, in summation, to do more than outline with bold strokes the vitals of this trial's mad and melancholy record, which will live as the historical text of the 20th century's shame and depravity. It is common to think of our own time as standing at the apex of civilization, from which the deficiencies of preceding ages may patronizingly be viewed in the light of what is assumed to be progress. The reality is that in the long perspective of history, the present century will not hold an enviable position unless its second half is to redeem its first. These 20 years in this 20th century will be recorded in the book of years as one of the most bloody in all annals. This was the philosophy of the National Socialists. When for years they have deceived the world and masked falsehood with plausibilities, can anyone be surprised that they will continue the habits of a lifetime in this dock? Credibility is one of the main issues of this trial. Only those who have failed to learn the bitter lesson of the last decade can doubt that men who have always played on the unsuspecting credulity of generous opponents would not hesitate to do the same now. It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this tribunal as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the Queen replied, then say they were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
Did you notice the reading copy was right there on the podium, the one I showed you before? It's one of the reasons I love doing research, because when I went to the Library of Congress and I saw that reading copy, and I was able to pick it up and hold it, but by the edges so I didn't damage it, it made me realize that I was holding a piece of history, very important part of history. And that's something that, as a researcher, I've gotten to do. And it's wonderful that we have a Library of Congress where these documents are and that you can actually go see them and touch them even. Now, Jackson returned to the Supreme Court after Nuremberg. He served for another 8 years. This photograph was taken of him in 1954, and you can see how he's aged. He had a heart attack in March, and then he had another fatal heart attack in October, right before the court began its next term. Jackson had 2 funerals. He had one in Washington at the National Cathedral, and he had another one here in Jamestown at St. Luke's Episcopal Church, right down the street. This is a photograph of that. I have the red arrow pointing to the St. Luke's sign. On either side of the picture, you see the 8 Supreme Court justices standing, watching as the coffin is carried past. So all 8 justices came here for the funeral. Jackson was buried in Maple Grove Cemetery. This is his tombstone, which I photographed last year. And on it, it says, Justice of the Supreme Court, Attorney General and Solicitor General of the United States, American Chief Counsel at Nuremberg. He kept the ancient landmarks and built the new. It's quite a lot to accomplish, especially because most of it he didn't accomplish until later in his life. He had spent so much of his life here, 49 years of his life here in Jamestown, and rose from humble beginnings all the way to the highest echelons of our government. It's quite remarkable. When I finished writing this, I felt that I had taken away something from Jackson's life myself, and even as an adult, it's good to be reminded of some of these things. One thing I took away was that really the way to success is to find out what you're good at, what you like to do, where your talents are, because we all have them. It's just find out what they are. And then, as Jackson did, once you find out what they are, you develop them, you improve them. You do what you have to learn more, to educate yourself so that you can be better at those skills. Like Jackson, we all are going to have obstacles to overcome, but you find a way. Because if you have a goal in your life, you work toward it and you find ways to overcome the problems that try to stop you. And Jackson did do that. He was principled. He believed in certain things and he thought about those things. He didn't just come to that casually. He really did think about his principles and he stuck to them. When he was on the Supreme Court, the majority might go one way. He would go the way he thought was right, sometimes surprising people. But he had a view of the way things should be, and that's the way he wrote and spoke. He dreamed big, and he worked hard to get to where he did. So those are things that spoke to me and I thought were worthwhile messages from his life. I hope that every one of you was able to take something out of Jackson's life too, that you can apply to your life and use to succeed. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gail, so much. It's just been terrific. And one of the things that I'd like to maybe have you share with is the answer to the question, what's next for Gail Jarrow?
Well, what's next for me, as I kind of mentioned, I'm writing about the Civil War spy balloons. And this is something most people don't know about. Does anybody know about the fact that the Union Army used spy balloons against the South? Yeah, oh, okay, good. Well, there were spy balloons. The Union Army for 2 years had people go up in balloons and look at the Confederate lines, the Confederate camps, count how many soldiers there were, try to figure out where they were moving and what they were doing. And it really did bother the Confederacy. They shot at these balloons all the time, and they never brought one down. But I thought it was a period of history that was interesting to me, the Civil War. And this was a way to write about the Civil War through the eyes of a balloonist, Thaddeus Lowe, who was the head of this balloon corps that worked for the Union Army. They weren't part of the Army, they were independent contractors. The Army paid them to do this spying. So that's what I'm working on, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it.
You have been incredible, Gail Jarrow, and I want to publicly thank you for all that you've meant to the Robert Jackson Center and the legacy of Robert Jackson, of which we are established. Not only has this book created an answer to the question of, tell me more about Robert Jackson, but it's also spawned a website, it's spawned teacher's guides, student guides. It's really been quite remarkable, all within really less than 1 year. And throughout the Southern Tier, people have been benefited by having your book and distributed throughout, and to have an opportunity to read and learn more about Robert Jackson and hopefully excite interest to learn more about him personally and the legacy of what that is. And just as a little token of our appreciation for all that you've meant here, we had a little floral bouquet, because we can't really thank you enough, Gail, but this is something, so I just want to thank you on behalf of the Jackson Center.
And you know, I love flowers. Thank you very much. Oh, they're great. Thank you. Thank you. You're all great. I think the work of the Jackson Center is so important. Robert Jackson is somebody that really has not gotten the attention that he deserves in history. And as we've been talking about, he's relevant today. And it's good to know the history of somebody like Robert Jackson and the period he lived through. So I applaud everything you're doing here at the Jackson Center, and I'm glad to be part of it in any way I can be.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, because I just love flowers.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for being such an attentive audience. Thank you for coming here today, making it a special effort. Also, thanks to the essay award winners, including C and Lars and Adasha, Allison, Genevieve, Kimberly. Thank you very much for a special, very special day. And for those who are not in the Maple Grove group, you get a chance to sit a little bit longer. The Maple Grove group has an opportunity to leave first. So with that, I stop and say thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.